So continuing on with the second part of our rangeland management lecture. So when we define rangeland management, what we're talking about is the careful use of rangeland resources. So we're talking about the plants, the animals, the soil, water, everything that falls within that rangeland ecosystem. And so we're going to carefully use those resources to meet the needs and desires of society without damaging the resource. That's what we consider proper range management to be, the careful use of the rangeland resources to meet the needs and desires of society without damaging the resource. The tricky part, of course, of that is the needs and desires of society, because it's constantly changing, and with society growing and spreading out and the demand for livestock production becoming more and more, it really changes the way that these rangelands areas are used. So livestock production has always been important, but there's a much greater emphasis now on wildlife management, recreation, water, just the idea of multiple use, the idea of not just using these areas for livestock production has become much greater. So the term that's going to best describe that is integrated or adaptive. And so when we're talking about adaptive management, we're saying based on a relationship between research and management practices, in which management practices are developed and modified based on a recurring evaluation of data for the purpose of allowing timely reactions to changing conditions on land to achieve, retain, or improve the ecological health and functionality of the land. So what are we saying there? We're going to use science, and we're going to use the management practices that we have. We're going to continually look at them and adjust and adapt them to make it to where we are doing our best to have the most effective rangeland possible. We're going to try and keep our ecosystem healthy and functioning because we're going to use science, and we're going to use the management that we have, and we're going to shift it around and do whatever we need to do in order to make sure that we're matching up to what that rangeland needs. So the big focus, though, for rangeland management, of course, is the activity of grazers and browsers and their relationship to rangeland productivity. Because if we're saying rangeland is land suitable for grazing, then the grazing is going to be a big determining factor in terms of how productive our rangelands are. And so one of the things we need to then think about is, what do we have in terms of tools to accomplish these tasks on rangelands? And one of the tools, or one of the things people probably don't think about as a tool, is just the idea of fences, and the idea of being able to control how much of an area is grazed, how big an area is, how many seasons that it's being given rest. That's all being done by just using simple fencing. You can, with a fence, you can change the number. You can also look at how, like, the different types of fences in order to keep certain animals in or out, and just the type of fence itself, electrified fence, barbed wire fence, wooden fence. It seems like such a simple tool, but it really is powerful in what it can do. Another tool to think about is just the idea of controlling the number of livestock that you have, because you can increase it or you can decrease it to meet your management objectives. So if you're in an area that needs a very heavy grazing, you're gonna want a certain number of livestock there. If you got an area that needs light grazing, you might want less livestock there. The species of livestock is also another tool in the tool bag. So cows generally prefer grasses, goats prefer shrubs, and sheep eat a mixed diet of grasses, grass, browse, and forb. So sheep are kind of the in-between. And then also your different species of livestock are very adapted to different areas. So sheep can graze much steeper slopes than cattle can. And then our last tool to mention, and trust me, there's many more, but just kind of some bigger, broader tools. The last tool to mention is the idea of fire. So fire being a natural force in pretty much all of the rangeland ecosystems. You can use prescribed burning, like the person in the example here, to where you're going to try and improve the rangeland quality, improve the forest quality, get rid of exotic species, manage growth. It's a very quick, easy, cheap way to be able to manage these grasslands. Now, I say easy, being that it's a really simplistic process. Put fire on the ground, watch it burn. In execution, it takes a lot of skill and isn't that easy. I should say it's a simple tool. Whether it's easy or difficult depends on the experience of the person doing the burning, but fire is a very simple tool. So we have four main primary influencing factors when it comes to rangeland productivity, and those four are the condition of the soil, the topography in the area, the climate of the area, and the animal density. So if we really think about rangeland productivity, we're really thinking about animal production and health. Because if we're saying that our land is productive, well, how are we going to measure that? Well, it's land suitable for grazing, so we're going to look at it as to what is the quality of the animals on this land. Well, that's going to be influenced by how good our soil is, the topography of the land, because that's going to change the amount of water that we get. It's going to change the amount of solar radiation, or how hot the area gets. You're also the climate will then become into play. Do we get big temperature fluctuations? Is this an area that snows? Is this an area that gets really hot in the summer? Is it an area that doesn't get a lot of precipitation? And then the last part of that is animal density, and not just whatever animals you're focusing on, but all the wildlife in the area as well. So how many different species are there, and how much do they eat, and is there enough browse around for all those species? And if you're going to introduce a domestic species into this area, is there enough food for both the domestic species and the wildlife in this area? So how do we really measure the rangeland productivity? So one of the ways we'll look at it is in terms of a term called grazing carrying capacity. And so what grazing carrying capacity is, it's the maximum number of animals that can graze each year on a given area without lowering the production, quality, or soil condition for a given number of days. So going over that again, the maximum number of animals you can have grazing in a specific area each year that do not cause damage to the land, and you have to set a specific number of days. But that's how we're going to measure grazing carrying capacity. So in dry years, your carrying capacity might be half the level that it is in normal years, because if you don't get that precipitation, you don't get the photosynthesis happening, there might not be enough green stuff to eat. Now that can become problematic, and that's where you get either you have to think about making the herd smaller, or you do supplemental feeding, and that's what you see a lot of these days is supplemental feeding through things like hay. In terms of the sustainability of rangelands, your grazing is going to be your key issue, because your carrying capacity is going to really determine a lot about how productive your land can be. And you can have problems in these areas with overgrazing and with undergrazing. So if you overgraze, you're going to end up with what we call decreaser species. Now, decreaser species are species that you want that the animals really like. And so if it's overgrazed, you're going to end up with a lot of decreaser species around, if it's overgrazed, you're going to end up with a lack of decreaser species, because that's the stuff that they like. Whereas if it's undergrazed, you're going to end up with a lot of increaser species. And the increaser species are ones that you don't want around, because that's the stuff that the animals themselves don't like. But what's going to happen is they don't like it, so they're not going to eat it. So it's going to keep increasing in numbers. Whereas our decreaser species, they like it, they eat it, so it's going to decrease in numbers. And that becomes really important to understand, because you really start figuring out what stuff do they prefer, and then you start saying, all right, well, now let me try and solve this problem, because they like this, but they don't like that. So how do I get rid of this one, and how do I increase this other one, because they really like it? And then that way you can really start figuring out how to start solving your issues. So let's look at overgrazing first. So here's a picture of some overgrazed rangeland in Texas. What do we consider overgrazing, or how would we define overgrazing? Overgrazing is continued heavy grazing by domestic or wild animals that exceeds carrying capacity, resulting in deterioration. Because remember, the big thing with carrying capacity and how we set that high mark to what the land can hold. The land can hold this many animals if they're not causing problems. So we define overgrazing as once you have an amount of animals that are doing heavy grazing that start causing problems to the land, that's overgrazing. Overgrazing leads to a loss of vegetation cover, can lead to erosion as well, because we talked about the idea of soil erosion before, and one of the big things is to keep plants and trees on the land, because then you get roots, and you can it helps keep water in the soil. Whereas if you don't have that vegetative cover, you're really susceptible to erosion. And then you can have severe cases where you get desertification, or the idea of it turning into desert-like conditions. So here's a picture from New South Wales, Australia, where they did a study, and you can see the difference between the fenced-in area versus the unfenced area, and the idea of how much browse is available for these animals in the fenced-in area versus the overgrazed areas outside of the fence. So overgrazing, the one thing that you really you don't want to think about it as saying like, oh, well, it's just, the cows or these domesticated animals that are causing the problem. Overgrazing is a problem that you can see with all sorts of different species. So this picture here on the right, there's a fence, and then you can see this is elk grazing in Yellowstone National Park. So elk, natural, native species, typical of that area, but they love willows. And so we've talked about Yellowstone before with the idea that the apex predator was removed. And you can see it in this picture, what happens if you have too many elk and they're not really controlled. You can see that there's a bunch of browse, and it's all gone because they removed it, because there's so many of them that you're exceeding that carrying capacity, and they're ending up overgrazing this area and then changing the habitat. And so I put this this graphic in here to just kind of tie a few of these ideas together that we've talked about in terms of soil and rangelands. And so the idea of what does good rangeland look like, what does moderate rangeland look like, and what does poor rangeland look like. And you can look, and I know it's in black and white, but you can see the grass and the amount of grass in the good and the moderate. And then when you look at that poor, you're really looking hard to try and figure out where is the grass, and that's problematic. And you can see on the right here it says grazing gradient. So the good rangeland, not a lot of grazing happening. Moderate, some grazing happening. Poor rangeland, lots of grazing or heavy grazing or overgrazing happening. Another just example of this idea of overgrazing and how it can affect and tie into the whole health of the ecosystem. So these are two areas where the area got grazed before a fire and where it wasn't grazed before a fire. And the fire went through both of these places. And you can see that in the areas that you have grazing and proper grazing, they ended up having coming back and growing back very easily, whereas the areas that didn't have grazing had problems. So in terms of grazing, it's not always problematic to have animals grazing. And remember, rangeland, that's why we have rangelands. They are vegetation suitable for grazing. So there is a proper amount of grazing. You don't want to overgraze. You don't want to undergraze. You want to Goldilocks it and get the just right amount of grazing. So it's really important to understand those ideas of what can affect your productivity, the factors that can affect your productivity, and what is carrying capacity, so that you really, really understand how to have the right amount of animals on your land. So we mentioned this term earlier, but desertification. So how would we define desertification? So it's the process, either natural or accelerated or human-induced, of reducing the biological productivity of rangelands and transforming those lands into desert. So how does this happen? You can have it through deforestation. You can have it through overgrazing. You can have it through poverty, political instability, unsustainable agriculture, climate change, all the above, some of the above, a combination of things on this list. And if you're saying to yourself, or if you're sitting there saying to yourself, well, how does poverty and political instability fit on this list? Well, if I'm living in some country where I don't have much of a way to make money, but I do have a bunch of land, and then somebody offers me a bunch of money for my land, and I give it to them, and I get the money, and then all of a sudden they take my land and they cut down every piece of vegetation on it to turn it into agricultural field or an urban center or any of those sorts of things. All of a sudden, that ecosystem is completely changed, and it could alter the greater ecosystem in ways that we don't know. Getting back to that idea of the nemesis effect. Political instability is the same way. You got a government that comes in, every 4 years or every 2 years, or it's changing all the time, and you don't know what they're going to say or what they're going to do, or if they're just going to come take your land and what's going to happen to it. And so that can also be problematic in terms of desertification. And desertification has a global impact because it really starts getting into some of those things we talked about before of just how many areas in the world where we'll have the proper amounts of net primary productivity, which means certain species might change places, which means the ecosystems might be altered. And when we've talked about before the idea of how this all can tie in together. And so desertification definitely has a global impact. And there's a video down below here on desertification, so make sure you click on that and watch that. But this graphic right here really just shows you where are the areas. We have already a lot of arid areas, and I think if you really look at this graphic isn't specifically rangelands. It says dry lands vulnerable to desertification. But notice where all these lands are. This is pretty much that same map we saw earlier where it just said rangelands of the world. We're seeing the same exact areas, but some of these areas do already have desert to them, and some of them, though, are very susceptible and very easily with climate change, and a few changes here or there could be subject to desert-like conditions. So we talked about overgrazing, but what about undergrazing? Because undergrazing can be just as problematic. So what is undergrazing? So that's when there's not enough plant material being removed to stimulate new growth. So in order for these plants to stimulate growth, you need to actually remove the older material from them so that the new leaves and the new shoots can come up. If you don't do that, it actually causes the plants to grow slower. And so why do this, or why should we care about undergrazing? So grasslands are evolved to understand modest grazing pressure, withstand modest grazing pressure. So they're made to handle it. They're okay with it. The grasslands themselves have found their niche, and they're okay with grazing pressure. And so if you have these undergrazed plants that have too much old leaf and stem biomass, they're not photosynthesizing at a high rate the way that younger leaves would. And that's why the new younger leaves are the most nutritious, because they're doing more photosynthesis, so they got more green to them, less brown and woody material, so they're just much more nutritious and much more palatable. And so if you start leaving all this old material, all this old unpalatable stuff that the animals don't want, all of a sudden they're not really going to be in that area because it doesn't have what they need. And so there is a video down here in the bottom right corner, so make sure to click on that. So how do we handle grazing then? If we know that overgrazing is a problem and we know that undergrazing is also a problem, we need to come up with some sort of grazing management. And the way that it's done is through grazing systems. So you come up with systems that will assist people in their operational goal, and your operational goals are usually improving pasture condition or increasing forage use or enhancing your livestock production. But when you think about your grazing system, you really got to think about balancing your soils, plants, animals, and this whole idea of multiple use together. So there's 4 kind of basic grazing systems. There's way more, but we're just going to focus on 4 kind of easier to understand grazing systems. So you've got continuous grazing, where if we take the period of a year, it's just animals in there the whole year, including the dormant season, and you don't move them or change them in any way. You have deferment, where you'll have a period of non-grazing during the growing season, so you make sure that you got enough plants that come up, and then the animals can go back to grazing. You can do rest, so you have no grazing for a whole year in a certain area. So you have your rangeland separated out using fence as a tool, and you send them off into one area and they graze it. Then you send them to another area and you leave that first area alone for a whole year. And then you could also have a rotation where you could have the scheduled movement of grazing animals from one area to another. And you can put these together, like you can have a deferred rotation and you can have areas of rest in there. And here's one good example of a rotational grazing system. So this is called the Merrill deferred rotation, or a 3-herd 4-pasture rotational grazing system. So you can see in 1999, from July to October, you got 3 herds. They're in 3 of the pastures and one of them's being rested. Then when it goes to November of 1999, you can see that then the herds get moved around and a different pasture is being rested, and you just kind of follow that same process. So there's always one piece of land that's getting the time to recover. Now, it also depends on what species you have in there and how quickly they recover and how big your herds are and what kind of animals you have and all these different things we've talked about. But this is just kind of the basics of how you would think about a grazing system. And so here's kind of a similar picture to what we saw with that overgrazing idea, where we've got our fence here, and on the left they're doing rotational grazing, and on the right they're doing continuous grazing. And so that area has been overgrazed to the point where there's not a lot of plant material, whereas the rotational area on the left, there's plenty of plant material there to still be ate. So it depends on on your area, your soil conditions, your climate, your topography, and how many animals you have as to what system is going to be best for your area. And I've got another video linked down here below. So in terms of grazing systems, one thing that's really important to remember is there is no right or best grazing system. The rotational one's often used, but like I said before, you can combine things like that deferred rotation with a rest block in it. But the rangeland managers just really got to match the grazing system to the environment and ecosystem of their rangeland, and the soils, topography, weather, and animal density is going to determine which grazing system is best suited. And then you want to bring in that adaptive management, that use of science-based rangeland grazing management strategies that's going to ensure ecological sustainability. So that's tying back into that idea of adaptive management that we spoke about before. When we're looking at the health of our rangeland, so health is different than productivity, because productivity we're looking at what we're getting off of the rangeland, whereas health we're just looking more at the function of the rangeland. Is the system okay? Is it doing what it needs to be? Is it functioning in the proper ways? And we're going to focus on three areas that really kind of provide that ecosystem balance. And those three areas are soil site stability, where we're thinking about the capacity of the area and how is the soil functioning, and is it okay, and are we suffering suffering from erosion of the soils. We're going to look at the hydrologic function. So what does our aquatic ecosystem look like within these rangeland areas? Do we have a good amount of groundwater? Are we getting a lot of surface runoff? Are we how does the whole hydrologic cycle look like? Where are we getting our precipitation from? Do we have lentic and lotic systems? That whole thing would play into our hydrologic function. And then the last one's our biologic integrity. So what's our capacity of our biotic community? So the plants, the animals, the microorganisms, do we have the right animals and the right amount of animals to support our ecological processes, or is there any one of those that could cause us issues or concerns? And so the last part of this lecture, we're going to focus on threats to the rangeland. And if you're looking at this picture and you're saying, well, yeah, but that's just some horses out on the rangeland. What's the threat? The horses there are a threat. And this is actually a picture taken in Nevada by a student, a former student in this class. And Nevada, as much of these western rangelands are suffering from a overgrown population of wild horses that are actually creating overgrazing problems within the western United States. And so I got a lot of videos here to really try to paint this picture to you guys. So really definitely check out all of these videos. They're all useful and really trying to help paint this picture. But we've already talked about the idea of overgrazing. One of the other rangeland threats that we haven't talked about is just invasive and exotic species. They can reduce the number of native species. They can form a species monoculture, like in the case of kudzu, where it just takes over a whole area and then that's the only species that you have for miles. They can affect the soil quality and the hydrology, which we just said are two of our biggest issues that we look at in terms of rangeland health. And then they can also affect the fire intensity. So if we want to use fire as one of our cheap and simple tools, that can be problematic depending on the species, because different species have different tolerances to fire and they grow to different sizes and have different flame lengths. So that could really make it hard to actually use fire on these areas. I have a picture of Las Vegas in here because another problem with rangelands is the idea of fragmentation from urban development. You'll get an increase in weed and you get an increase in invasive species because you got people coming from all around in different places, and that's how you end up with an introduction of invasive species. But the one that's the focus of this page here and the slide before is the problem with the free roaming horses and burros, the wild Mustangs of the West. It's actually a really, really big problem, a really expensive problem, much more expensive than you'd realize. But there's videos and articles linked on this page, and really look at how big of an issue it is and how much money our government is spending on keeping these animals around. And the real big issue there is that horses were once native to North America. They went away. That species of horse became extinct, but then the Europeans brought over horses, and because horses had already lived on this land, the horses they brought over were like, oh, well, we can handle this. This makes sense to us. This all works perfectly. And so now, because we don't eat horse and we don't find that killing horses is an okay thing, we have this overabundant population that nobody seems to quite know how to handle. And it's costing a lot of money, and it's destroying the ecosystem. What I want you guys to understand, though, is I'm not an anti-horse guy. I'm a guy who's gone and ridden horses down in Arizona, to where I've just looked over some of these rangelands while on horseback, and I find that to be a beautiful thing. It's just one of those things where you really have to try and understand ecosystem health and function, and realize that it's a problem, and it's a real problem that's just going to really destroy and deteriorate the land unless we find a good way to deal with it. And so here's a couple of ways to deal with it. So I've got the links here to these different programs where people are hopefully trying to find a home for some of these horses and trying to find a way to solve this issue. And these last couple slides, I just want to just kind of show you, or give you kind of a piece of my appreciation of rangelands. This is Caprock Canyon State Park in Texas, where, it's places that I've been in terms of rangelands, and places that in this last slide where I've gone hiking with my dog, and I love rangelands. I love spending time in them. It's one of the reasons why I was okay with coming to Bakersfield College and taking a job there, and seeing this area and the rangelands that are available here. In terms of we've got the Windwolves Preserve, which is 93,000 acres of rangeland, just an hour south of the campus, and we've got all the chaparral areas in Southern California. And to me, I love rangelands. I love the ecosystem, and I'm hoping we really find a way to manage it better so that it's something that stays around for generations. Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture. Talk to you next time.